The body was already on the ground when Kaylee's Devereaux saw it. Not moving, not twitching, just there. Face pressed into the cracked asphalt like the road had swallowed him halfway and stopped caring. The gray suit the man wore was torn at the shoulder, dark at the collar with something wet and spreading. Smoke curled lazy and slow from the wrecked black sedan 20 feet ahead, drifting into a sky that had gone the color of a bruise. Purple at the edges, yellow-gray at the center, the kind of sky that showed up right before something breaks wide open. Kaylee's squeezed his handlebars. His palm came up and covered his mouth. Not fear, restraint, because the sound trying to climb out of his chest had nowhere to go. It never did. And right now, the last thing he needed was to look like he was falling apart on a cracked stretch of road in the middle of nowhere, with 7 men in black suits walking toward him from 3 black cars parked further up the road like they'd been waiting there the whole time. Behind him, small fingers dug deeper into his shirt. The child, his pup, Zion, pressed his forehead against Kaylee's shoulder blade and held on without a word. 4 years old, and already he'd learned to read the tension in his carrier's spine. Already knew when to go still. Kaylee's kept both hands on the bars. His eyes moved between the body on the ground and the 7 men closing the distance. They weren't running. That was the part that felt wrong. A man was lying on the road, bleeding into the asphalt cracks, and these men were walking, measured, controlled, like they'd rehearsed exactly how many steps they were supposed to take. The fields on either side of the road were dry and flat and offered nothing. No turn-off, no cover, just dead grass stretching back into the distance and one thin road going forward and the smoke and the body and those 7 men between him and the other side. Kaylee's had 3 options. Turn around, keep going straight, or stop. He told himself to turn around. His hands didn't move. The suited men slowed, then stopped, and every single one of them looked directly at him. Not at the body. Not at the crashed car. At him. Zion's fingers tightened. Hi viewers. If you found a dying stranger on an empty road with powerful men watching, would you stop? Or would you keep riding? Drop your honest answer in the comments right now. And that's when Kaylee's heard it. Faint. So faint it almost wasn't real. A breath. One single, rattling, wet breath rising up from the man on the ground. He was alive. Kaylee's jaw tightened behind his palm. The 7 men still hadn't moved. Still hadn't spoken. Still hadn't looked anywhere but straight at him. Like they were waiting to see what he would do before they decided what they were going to do. The sky pressed down lower. The smoke kept curling. And somewhere deep in Kaylee's Devereaux's chest, the thing that always got him into trouble, the thing that had never once listened to logic or self-preservation, started making the decision for him. 3 hours before the smoke and the body and the 7 silent men, Kaylee's had counted his money on the kitchen table while Zion slept. $17. He'd laid it out flat. 2 5s, 6 singles. A handful of coins that clicked against the table like a small, embarrassing confession. He'd stared at it for a moment. Not with grief, not with anger. Just the flat, practiced look of a man doing the math he already knew the answer to. $17 and a delivery bag and a bicycle that creaked on the left side when the road tilted wrong. That was Wednesday. That was everything. He'd packed Zion up before the sun finished rising. Settled the carrier across his back. Felt the small weight shift and settle and lock into place the way it always did. Like Zion belonged there. Like this was the arrangement the universe had decided on and neither of them had argued. Nobody had asked Kaylee's if he wanted a child. Nobody had asked Kaylee's much of anything, really. When you couldn't speak. When your voice had been stripped from you by something the doctors had a long name for and the world had a short patience for. People filled in the rest themselves. They decided what you meant. They decided what you felt. They decided what you were capable of. He'd been doing deliveries for 2 years. Long routes. Heavy bags. Miles that would have broken somebody who was doing it for the experience. He wasn't doing it for the experience. He'd learned early how to keep his face neutral when dispatchers talked past him, how to hold a phone toward customers and point at the order confirmation when they asked questions he had no way to answer out loud, how to let people assume he was slow or rude or difficult, because explaining the truth required a voice he didn't have and time nobody wanted to give. Mute, omega, alone. 3 facts that, stacked together, made the world treat you like a smudge on glass. Present, visible, irrelevant. He'd fed Zion, strapped his bag, and headed out into the yellow-gray morning with $17 in his pocket and 6 deliveries on his route. The first 4 had gone fine. The 5th had taken him down a road he didn't usually use, a longer cut through the dry stretch east of the main road, less traffic, easier on the chain. He'd been making good time. Then he'd seen the sedan. Even from a distance it looked wrong. Nose angled into the shoulder, driver door hanging open, front crumpled like something had hit it hard or it had hit something harder. No hazard lights. No movement inside. He'd slowed. Told himself to stop slowing. Kept going. Told himself not to look back. Looked back. And that's when he saw the man in the gray suit on the ground. And that's when Zion's fingers, those small, certain, 4-year-old fingers, tightened around the strap of the carrier and held on like an anchor, like a choice. He got off the bicycle. That was the first mistake or the first decision, depending on how it ended. Kaylee's leaned it against his leg and looked down at the man for 3 full seconds. Mid-40s. Face slack. Expensive suit gone ruined. There was a cut above his left ear leaking slow and dark, and his breathing, when it came like something dragging itself over gravel. Kaylee's looked up. The black cars were still there in the distance. The suited men hadn't come closer, hadn't called out, just watched from far enough away that he couldn't read their faces. He looked back at the man. He pulled out his phone. No signal. He held it higher. Turned in a slow circle. 1 bar flickered into existence and disappeared before he could do anything with it. He tried anyway. Tapped the emergency call button, held it to his ear, heard nothing, got nothing. He put the phone away. He crouched beside the man and put 2 fingers against the side of his throat. Pulse. Weak and irregular, but there. He turned the man's head slightly, careful, the way he'd seen done once in a training video that came with a job he hadn't kept. The breathing opened up a fraction. Small. But something. He needed to move him. He stood and looked at the cars again. Still watching. He gestured at them. Wide, desperate, both arms. The universal language of please come here. Something is wrong. I need help. One of the men shifted his weight. None of them moved. Fine. Kaylee's adjusted Zion on his back. Felt the boy tighten up, felt him breathing fast, and then bent down and got his arms under the injured man's shoulders. Dead weight. The man had 50 pounds on him easy, maybe more. Kaylee's pulled anyway. His back screamed. The asphalt scraped under the man's heels as he dragged him inch by inch toward the edge of the road. Away from the sun, away from the open lane. Took 6 minutes. His shirt was soaked through by the end. Zion didn't say a word. When Kaylee's finally got the man propped in the thin shade of the shoulder's edge, he stood up and looked at the damage. The blood on his own hands, the shallow rise and fall of the man's chest, and made the second decision. He flagged down the first car that passed. A beat-up pickup that slowed only when Kaylee's literally stepped into the road with both arms out. The driver, an older man suspicious, rolled his window down 2 inches. Kaylee's held up his phone, pointed at the injured man, pointed toward town. The driver shook his head. Too much trouble. Wrong day. Not his problem. The second car didn't stop at all. The third one, a delivery van heading back toward the east side of the city, stopped because the driver recognized a delivery bag and figured it was a colleague. She took one look at the man on the ground and at Kaylee's hands and said, "Get in." He got in. The hospital intake took 40 minutes of waiting and gesturing and a nurse who kept asking him questions and writing down his silence as non-cooperation. By the time they got the man through stable, they said critical but stable, Kaylee's had spent $17. The ride. The initial supplies from a small pharmacy 2 blocks from the hospital, the ones the intake desk said they couldn't provide up front. Everything. He stood outside the hospital with Zion asleep against his back and his wallet empty and his bicycle parked outside and his hand still shaking, and he looked at nothing for a long time. Then the man's hand, the one Kaylee's had steadied on the gurney when they were moving him in, had reached up, fingers closing around his wrist. Tight, deliberate. Then gone still again, like a message, or a warning. Nobody called. For days passed and the phone stayed quiet and Kaylee's went back to his route like the road east had never happened. He rode. He delivered. He came home. He fed Zion and washed dishes and sat at the kitchen table at night with no $17 to count anymore, and the math made a different kind of silence than usual. The hunger wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It just arrived the way inconvenience arrives when you're already tired, low, constant, easy to push past until you couldn't. He borrowed rice from a neighbor downstairs. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself that with his hands because that was the only way he told himself anything. Tapping his fingers on the counter in the rhythm of whatever thought he was trying to hold still long enough to examine. Zion ate first. Always. That was the rule. The only rule that mattered on the bad days. He watched the news once by accident. Didn't own a television, but the woman across the hall had hers turned up loud enough that the sound bled through the wall on Tuesday evening. Something about a wealthy man, a business figure, they said, the kind of language used for people whose names moved money, who had survived a car accident on a rural stretch east of the city. Miraculous recovery. A spokesperson said he was resting and would return to business matters within the week. Kaylee's listened to this through a wall. Then he turned away. He didn't think about the wrist that had gripped his. Didn't think about the 7 men who had watched and done nothing. Didn't think about the $17 or the empty wallet or the rice he'd borrowed. The world doesn't punish cruelty, he thought, in the silent language of his own chest. It just ignores kindness and moves on. He slept. Thursday morning, Zion woke him up by pressing a small hand flat against his cheek and pointing toward the window. Kaylee's opened his eyes. He heard it before he saw it. Engines. More than one. He got up slow, walked to the window, looked down at the street below. 7 luxury vehicles. Parked in a line outside his building like a statement. Black. Clean. Expensive. The kind of cars that made the entire block look like it was apologizing for existing. The neighbors came out first. That was always how it went in this part of the city. Cars like that showed up and windows opened and doors cracked and people drifted out onto the steps and the sidewalk with their phones already raised, already recording, already sending. It took less than 2 minutes for a small crowd to form at the edges of the scene, just far enough back to feel safe, just close enough to catch everything. Kaylee's stood at his own door. He'd come down with Zion on his back because leaving the boy upstairs alone wasn't something he did. He'd stepped out into the thin morning light with his face composed. The careful blank he'd spent years perfecting, the one that looked like calm and felt like holding your breath, and watched the doors of 7 vehicles open in sequence. Suits stepped out, then more suits, then the man from the road. He looked nothing like the person Kaylee's had dragged across cracked asphalt. Nothing like the slack, bleeding weight he'd steadied onto a gurney with shaking hands. This man stood straight, shoulders back, jacket pressed, face arranged into the specific kind of stillness that money buys. Not peace, but control. The kind of face that had never needed to make itself understood through gestures. He was alive, completely, and he was looking at Kaylee's the way you look at a problem you've already decided the answer to. He spoke to the suited men around him first, low and quick. 2 of them moved toward the building entrance. One spoke to a man near the vehicles. The others spread out. Not dramatically, not threateningly, just enough to define the space, to establish who it belonged to. The phones kept rolling. A woman near the steps said something to her neighbor, and her neighbor shook her head. Kaylee's watched all of it. Then the man stepped forward. He didn't introduce himself, didn't say Kaylee's name, didn't gesture toward the cars or the crowd or the situation he'd assembled outside a stranger's apartment building on a Thursday morning. He just said, calm, flat, carrying across the silence like it had been measured for exactly this distance. There is a watch missing. It was in my possession at the time of the accident. He looked at Kaylee's. You were the only person present. The crowd shifted. A murmur. Someone's phone adjusted its angle. Kaylee's felt his jaw tighten. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Nothing could come out. It never could. His hands started to move, the small, instinctive signs he used, knowing full well almost nobody around him could read them, and then he stopped. Because the man's expression didn't change, didn't soften, didn't register the gesture as language. It registered it as guilt. Search his place, the man said. Not a question, not a request. Just a direction, delivered to the men behind him like Kaylee's door was already open, like his home was already evidence, like the decision had been made before the cars had even parked. Two suited men moved toward the entrance. Zion's fingers tightened, and Kaylee stood in the doorway of his own building, mute, empty-pocketed, surrounded by cameras and judgment and the man he had spent everything to save, with absolutely no way to make a single word come out of his mouth. The crowd watched. The phones recorded, and one of the suited men, third from the left, younger than the others, eyes that moved differently from the rest, stopped walking just before the entrance. Just for a second. His hand tightened at his side. Then he kept going. If Kaylee's could speak just one sentence in that moment, what would he say? Drop it in the comments. Let's see what you've got. They went through everything. Every drawer. Every shelf. Every cabinet that had anything in it and several that had nothing at all. Two of the suited men moved through Kaylee's apartment with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before. Not carelessly, not violently, but with the particular coldness of people who had been told they had permission and so didn't feel the need to apologize for it. Kaylee's stood in the doorway and watched. Zion pressed his face into the back of Kaylee's neck and stayed there. The apartment wasn't large. One room that served as everything, living, eating, sleeping for Zion, working for Kaylee's. A bathroom with a cracked tile above the sink that the landlord had been promising to fix for 8 months. A kitchen counter with a rice cooker and 3 dishes and a drawer that held nothing but rubber bands and a spare bike chain and the small notebook Kaylee's used to write things down when typing on his phone wasn't fast enough. They opened the notebook. One of them flipped through it. Pages of handwritten shorthand, delivery addresses, grocery lists, the careful columns he used to track spending down to the last dollar. The man looked at it for a moment, then set it down. No watch, no jewelry, no evidence of anything. Nothing that looked like it had come from someone else's life. They checked under the mattress, inside the single closet, behind the small shelf near the door where Zion's drawings were tacked up in a crooked row. Pencil and crayon figures on torn notebook paper, the kind of art that only exists when a child has no coloring book but still needs to make something. One of the men paused in front of those drawings, just for a second, then kept moving. Outside in the hallway and down on the street, the crowd had grown. Kaylee's could hear the low hum of it through the open door, voices and phone notifications and the shuffle of people moving to get a better angle. Someone down there laughed. He didn't know why and he didn't want to. He kept his face still, kept his hands at his sides, kept breathing like breathing was a choice he was making deliberately. Zion shifted. Is it okay? The boy whispered. Barely a sound, just air shaped like a question. Kaylee's reached back and pressed his palm flat against the boy's knee. Once. Steady. The suited men finished. They moved back toward the door with nothing in their hands and nothing on their faces and stepped past Kaylee's like he was furniture. He heard one of them murmur something into a device at his wrist as he passed. Then silence from inside the apartment. Kaylee's turned toward the street. The man from the road, Callum Voss, though Kaylee's didn't know his name yet, didn't know anything about him except that he'd been bleeding and now he was standing exactly where he'd been. Same posture, same controlled expression. He looked at the two suited men as they reached him. They shook their heads, and Callum Voss looked back up at Kaylee's, and didn't stop, didn't retract, didn't say a single word of correction to the crowd that was still watching, still recording, still carrying whatever story they'd already built in their heads from the sight of 7 luxury cars and 2 men searching a small apartment while a mute man stood in the doorway with a child on his back. The accusation was still standing, even after the evidence refused to show up. The third suited man from the left hadn't moved in 2 minutes. That was the one thing Kaylee's kept tracking. Not the crowd, not the cameras, not even Callum Voss's expression, which had gone tighter in the last 30 seconds in a way that most people probably wouldn't notice. Kaylee's noticed it. He'd spent his whole life reading people the way others read sentences. Carefully, completely, looking for the part that told him what the words weren't saying. This man was different from the others. Younger, maybe early 30s. Built the same, dressed the same, standing in formation the same. But his eyes moved wrong. While the others watched Kaylee's, this one kept cutting sideways. To Callum Voss. Then down to something in his hand. A phone, held low against his thigh, screen tilted away from everyone. His jaw was doing something. Working at something he hadn't said yet. Kaylee's watched him the way you watch a door that hasn't opened but keeps moving in the frame. Callum Voss spoke again. This time to the crowd as much as to anyone specific, his voice carrying the easy, awful confidence of someone who had always had an audience when he needed one. The situation is being handled, he said. I want to be very clear about the timeline of events. He started talking. He talked about the accident. About the watch. A family piece, he said, irreplaceable, present on his wrist that morning and missing when he woke up at the hospital. He talked about Kaylee's being the only person on that road. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point. He didn't have to. The facts, arranged the way he was arranging them, pointed themselves. The crowd listened. Someone near the back said something that got a murmur of agreement. Kaylee's felt his chest tighten. Because here was the specific cruelty of the situation. Not that people believed Callum Voss, but that they had no reason not to. A well-dressed man with 7 vehicles and a controlled voice, talking about a missing valuable, while a mute delivery worker stood in the doorway of a 1-room apartment that had just been searched. The story wrote itself. He couldn't interrupt it, couldn't correct it, couldn't stand up and say, wait, let me show you what actually happened. Let me walk you through the blood and the cracked road and the $17 I handed to a stranger and never got back. His hands moved. Nobody was looking at his hands. Then the third suited man's phone lit up. The man looked down at it. His entire face changed. Not dramatically, not a gasp, not a flinch. Just a small, fast rearrangement. The kind that happens when a person receives information that disrupts everything they thought they were standing in. He looked at the screen for 3 seconds. Then he looked up at Callum Voss. Then he looked at Kaylee's. And something crossed his face that Kaylee's had not seen once in the last 40 minutes. Recognition. He took 1 step forward, then stopped himself. His hand came up slightly. A movement that almost became a gesture and then pulled back like he'd thought better of it. He was working something out. Right there, in real time, in the middle of the sidewalk with phones rolling and the crowd murmuring and his employer still talking. This man was working something out. And whatever it was, it mattered. Because his grip on the phone had gone tight enough that his knuckle had gone pale. He stepped forward. Not fast. Not with any dramatic announcement. Just a single step out of formation, clean, deliberate, the kind of step that a person takes when they've decided that not stepping forward is no longer something they can live with. The name on his badge, visible now at the angle he'd turned, read Tremaine. He said, "Sir." One word. Callum Voss stopped talking. The crowd went quieter than it had been since the cars pulled up. Not silent. Phones were still running, someone coughed. A child somewhere down the block made a sound. But the specific quality of the noise changed. Anticipation has a texture. This was it. Tremaine held up his phone, turned the screen toward Callum Voss. "The watch was recovered," he said. "This morning. Crash site recovery team found it in the wreckage. It was logged into the inventory at 6:42 a.m. He paused. "I just received the confirmation." Pause on that. 6:42 a.m. Before the cars had even left for this building. Callum Voss looked at the screen. He looked for a long time, longer than it should have taken to read 4 lines of text. His jaw shifted. His hand came up and then went back down. He looked at Tremaine with an expression that moved through several things quickly and settled on none of them. The crowd was watching all of this. Every phone stayed up. Someone near the front said, quietly but not quietly enough, "Wait, so he didn't take it?" No one answered. Kaylee stood in the same place he'd been standing the whole time. He hadn't moved. His posture hadn't changed. His face hadn't opened up into relief or closed down into anger. He just stood there and let the moment exist without trying to control what it became. Zion still had his face pressed into the back of Kaylee's neck, still holding on. Callum Voss lowered his eyes from the phone. He turned, slowly, like a man turning into weather he'd brought on himself, and looked at Kaylee's directly. Really looked. Not the way he'd looked before, with that flat assessment, that immediate conclusion already built and furnished. This was different. This was a man looking at another person for the first time after spending 40 minutes treating them like a category. The crowd had gone from murmuring to watching. Just watching. Callum Voss opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. "The item has been located," he said, to no one in particular, which meant to everyone. "At the crash site." A beat. This was a misunderstanding. 3 words that carried the weight of everything they didn't say. Not "I was wrong." Not "I accused an innocent man in front of his neighbors and his child." Not "I had 7 cars and a team of people and I used all of it to stand outside this man's home and dismantle him in public on a Thursday morning." Just misunderstanding. The crowd shifted. Phones lowered slightly, not all the way. And all of it. Every eye, every lens, every neighbor who'd watched from a careful distance, turned toward Kaylee's. Waiting. Wondering what he was going to do with the moment that had just landed in his hands. Callum Voss walked toward him. He stopped about 6 feet away, close enough for conversation, far enough to still be making a choice about it. He straightened his jacket. Briefly, almost reflexively, the way people straighten their appearance when they're about to say something they've never had to say before. "I want to," he started. He stopped. Started again. What happened today was not handled correctly. He didn't look away when he said it. That part seemed important to him. Maintaining eye contact, keeping his voice level, presenting the apology in a format that still had some structure to it, some shape he could control. "I acted on incomplete information. That was wrong." The crowd was still there, still recording. Every word was going somewhere permanent. Kaylee's looked at him. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head, didn't make any movement that could be read as forgiveness or rejection. He just looked. The same careful, complete way he'd been looking at things his whole life. The way you learn to look when your voice isn't available to fill the space. Callum Voss continued. He mentioned compensation. A number that, even spoken at a low volume 6 feet away, made 2 of the neighbors visibly react. He mentioned security, a vague word that seemed to mean protection, coverage, some arrangement that would ensure Kaylee's and the child didn't carry the cost of this day forward into the next. He said, "Whatever you need." And he meant it. That was the complicated part. He actually meant it. There was no performance in it. The crowd was still there, but he wasn't talking to them anymore. He was talking to Kaylee's. Just Kaylee's. As if the 40 minutes before this one had rearranged something in him too, and he was still figuring out what the new arrangement looked like. Kaylee's listened to all of it. He stood completely still and let every word reach him. And then, when Callum Voss finished, when the offer was fully laid out and the silence came back, Kaylee's thought about the $17. Not with anger. Not even with grief exactly. Just the memory of it. The flatness of those bills on the kitchen table. The click of coins. The math that had already been done. He thought about the man's hand gripping his wrist in the hospital hallway. He thought about Zion's fingers tightening on the carrier strap. He thought about what it cost to be kind in a world that reads kindness as weakness until it needs proof otherwise. And then he thought, very clearly, without drama, without heat. What hurt wasn't the accusation. It was how fast I became disposable. He reached up, unclipped Zion from the carrier, set the boy down gently beside him, one hand on the boy's shoulder, keeping him close. Then Kaylee's looked at Callum Voss one last time. Not with anger, not with mercy either, just recognition. The kind between two people who now understand exactly what the other one is. He picked up his bicycle, and he turned away. He walked, not fast, not slow. The bicycle beside him, one hand on the grip, Zion keeping pace with those short 4-year-old steps that somehow always matched wherever Kaylee's was going. The crowd parted. Nobody stopped him. Nobody spoke. The phones that were still up didn't feel like weapons anymore. They felt like witnesses, which was different. Something had shifted in the last 3 minutes that nobody had a clean word for yet, but everyone on that sidewalk had felt it. Callum Voss didn't follow. He stood where he was and watched Kaylee's walk and said nothing. Tremaine watched too, hands at his sides now, phone gone back into his pocket, expression carrying the particular quietness of a man who did the right thing and is still working out what it cost. Kaylee's reached the end of the block and kept going. The same road, same cracked concrete. Same morning light coming in at the same angle it always did on this part of the city, yellow and flat and honest in the way that early light is honest. It shows everything without commentary. He thought about the day on the road east of the city. The smoke. The man on the ground. The way he'd almost kept riding. The way Zion's fingers had made the decision his brain was still negotiating. He didn't regret stopping. That was the thing he kept coming back to, turning over slowly in his chest as he walked. Not the $17. Not the hospital hours. Not the 40 minutes of standing in his own doorway while his home was turned inside out and his neighbors filmed it and a man he'd dragged back to life stood on his sidewalk and called him a thief. Not any of that. He didn't regret stopping. Because stopping, that one choice on a cracked road under a bruised sky, was the truest thing about him. And no accusation, no search, no public humiliation, no crowd, no camera could reach back in time and make it wrong. What he was giving up, walking away from the offer, the money, the protection, wasn't weakness. It was the same decision in a different shape. He had given everything he had to a stranger without asking what it would return. He wasn't about to accept a return that came wrapped in an apology that had taken an hour and a watch to arrive. Zion looked up at him. Big eyes. Quiet face. Kaylee's looked down and let the corner of his mouth lift. Just slightly. The boy reached up and took his hand. And they kept walking. The 7 luxury vehicles stayed parked on the street behind them. The crowd thinned out. The phones eventually dropped. The story would be posted somewhere before noon, clipped and cropped into whatever angle felt most interesting to the person who'd recorded it. None of it reached him. He was already somewhere else. Not ahead of it. Not above it. Just through it. Out the other side. Back on the same road, the same bicycle, the same life, but standing in it differently now. Because strength doesn't announce itself. It just keeps moving. Kindness doesn't need a witness. It already knows what it did. And some victories don't look like winning. They look like a man on a bicycle, a child beside him, walking quietly into the morning like the hardest part is already behind them. Because for Kaylee's Devereaux, it was, he didn't take anything from me that day. He revealed what I should never give again. If this story moved you, if Kaylee's quiet strength said something you've been carrying yourself, leave a comment. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Because every week, this channel brings you stories of people who chose courage when it cost them everything. Don't miss the next one.